them. Here at Beyond Verses, we will do a deep dive into an interesting book. Whether you're Christian, belong to another faith, or have no religion at all, you're welcome here. Because discovering timeless life lessons hits it in one of history's most influential books, the Holy Bible.
I am so incredibly excited to have you here today because we're going to unpack a narrative that reads almost exactly like a two-part storybook, but it carries these massive implications for understanding human nature and devotion. We're looking at the final two chapters of the historical text of Nehemiah. On the one hand, we've got a towering spiritual victory, a moment of just profound triumph and celebration. But on the other hand, the text presents the creeping, silent danger of everyday compromise. It's a completely fascinating study in contrasts. All right, let's just dive right into this joyful peek. Picture the scene in Nehemiah 12, because it is nothing short of spectacular. The massive walls of Jerusalem, which the Israelites labored so intensely to rebuild, are finally complete. The air is literally echoing with an unforgettable celebration of dedication. As this quote captures so beautifully, there are great sacrifices, incredible rejoicing, and a profound sense of joy given by God. It's the ultimate mountaintop experience, you know? But, this brings up a really fascinating question. Think about it for a second. The confetti has settled, the music has faded, and the grand project is officially checked off the list. So, what happens when the great celebration ends and the routine of normal life actually begins? We're turning the page from the immense excitement of a finished project to the quiet and, honestly, sometimes challenging tension of the morning after. And that right there brilliantly sets up our two-act play for today's explainer. We're looking at a super stark contrast. In Nehemiah 12, we see dedication, passion, and immense joy. But right next door in Nehemiah 13, we see compromise, neglect, and this slow spiritual drift. Beginning a journey well is fantastic. It truly is. But the text illustrates that finishing well requires a completely different level of constant daily vigilance. So let's look at Act 1, the Great Celebration, found in Nehemiah chapter 12. I really want you to lean into the sheer joy of this first act. The Israelites were overflowing with immense gratitude, really recognizing that the wall wasn't built by human strength alone. Now, what's super interesting here is the specific order of their worship. Before they threw a massive party, the priests, Levites, and the people actually took time to purify themselves. The text highlights a critical principle here, the belief that God desires a clean character and a clean heart before any outward performance. From there, they moved to thanksgiving, giving God the glory for the victory. And finally, unity. They literally had two large choirs marching around the wall from opposite directions before meeting at the temple. Everyone prays together, projecting the idea that unity magnifies glory. This ancient celebration actually carries a huge message about human nature. The source text makes a vital application for its readers here, suggesting that true worship comes from gratitude, not merely from religious routine. It warns against praying fervently before a success, but completely forgetting that gratitude after the success is achieved. Whether it's a major milestone or massive growth, the overarching message of the text is that these should be moments for deep thanksgiving rather than pride, and that remembering where you came from makes your worship genuine. Now, looking at the timeline of events, we see a pretty dramatic shift in our narrative. We go from day one, where the wall is built and dedicated, to years later. Nehemiah actually leaves to serve the Persian king. And sometime after he departs, the bright mountaintop of victory begins to descend into the shadowy valley of routine, and compromise creeps in. Later, when Nehemiah finally returns to Jerusalem, he finds a vastly different scene. Which brings us to Act 2, the threat of small compromises in Nehemiah 13. When Nehemiah finally steps back into Jerusalem, he is absolutely floored. The people had completely abandoned the spiritual reforms they had celebrated so passionately. Spiritual victories, as the narrative frames it, must be actively protected. Just look at the very first shocking compromise Nehemiah discovers. A man named Tobiah, who was a known enemy of Israel, was actually given a room right inside God's holy temple. This is staggering within the context of the story. The very space meant for holy offerings was handed over to someone who had actively opposed the rebuilding of the walls in the first place. It's really meant to show how incredibly small compromises can escalate into glaring betrayals. So this poses a deeply personal question drawn right from the text. Are you making room for what God has rejected? The core lesson Nehemiah imparts to its readers is to never tolerate spiritual compromise, period. When Nehemiah found Tobiah in the temple, he didn't sit down and write a polite letter. He immediately threw Tobiah's belongings out and purified the space. The text argues that seemingly small compromises can slowly take control and become dangerous strongholds if they aren't dealt with immediately. And you see, the crucial point here is the massive domino effect of neglected duties. In chapter 12, the people understood that giving was an act of devotion. But by chapter 13, the people had entirely neglected their offerings. Because of this, the Levites lost their financial support. And as a direct result of that, those ministry workers had to abandon their posts just to find jobs to survive. The narrative shows that when the people stopped giving their best, the communal work literally ground to a halt. But the compromise didn't just stop at finances. It bled right into their time. Business and personal gain completely took over the Sabbath day. People ignored the command to keep the day holy and treated it like any other day of commerce. To stop this, Nehemiah took bold action. He physically closed the city gates to prevent business, forcing a pause. Within the narrative, it's a really powerful illustration of the belief that God desires to be prioritized over busy schedules and personal gain. Then we see another incredibly subtle but deeply tragic drift in the story. Some Israelites had entered into unwise marriages with people who led their families away from their core beliefs. And the result? A generation of children who could no longer even speak the language of God's people. They were entirely disconnected from their spiritual heritage. For the author of Nehemiah, this proves that the people closest to us greatly influence our spiritual lives, really emphasizing the text's clear stance on the need to choose relationships carefully. Now, Nehemiah didn't just stand on the sidelines and watch this happen. He confronted all of it directly. He threw out the enemy's belongings, restored the temple offering so ministry could resume, closed the gates on the Sabbath, and addressed those wrong relationships. The text presents Nehemiah as the ultimate archetype of a godly leader, someone who doesn't just ignore problems, but rather speaks truth with courage and confronts issues head-on to bring about total restoration. And this brings us to a really powerful, honestly somewhat haunting realization, the moral of our storybook. Buildings can remain standing, while true devotion completely disappears. The physical stone wall around Jerusalem was still standing perfectly tall, entirely intact. Yet, behind that beautiful wall, the people's hearts had completely crumbled. The striking takeaway is that external success means absolutely nothing if the internal foundation grows cold. Let's move on to our final section, guarding your spiritual life every day. So how exactly does the text suggest we avoid this kind of drift? Let's open up the spiritual maintenance toolkit it outlines to ensure devotion doesn't vanish like it did for the Israelites. Keeping that relationship alive in a wildly busy world is presented as taking intentional daily effort. It points directly to daily prayer, consistent study, intentional worship, and immediate obedience. These are incredibly practical steps. Just like a house needs constant maintenance to prevent decay, the book of Nehemiah argues that spiritual growth requires daily attention so you don't drift away. Bringing our whole narrative full circle, we can see this grand contrast laid out so clearly here. Beginning well is like Nehemiah 12, one day of loud, joyful, emotional dedication. But finishing well, as we learn from Nehemiah 13, requires a lifetime of quiet, constant maintenance. The easy thrill of a massive victory celebration is wonderful, for sure, but the text insists it absolutely must be matched by the tough, necessary grit of everyday faithfulness. I really want to share this poignant plea from Nehemiah, which is a standout verse from the text. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. This beautifully showcases the heart of a character who didn't just start a building project, it's the heart of someone who fought fiercely to finish his spiritual journey with absolute integrity. And that leaves us with one final, profound challenge drawn straight from Nehemiah's story. As you reflect on the themes we've covered and the daily choices outlined in this historical account, the text poses a lingering question. Will you merely celebrate the beginning, or will you do the hard, necessary daily work to faithfully finish the story? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating text with me today.